Hello everyone. In this video, I want to talk about what I believe to be one of the most important lessons to learn about the road to the Civil War, but it's also one of the most interesting thought experiments, right? And it's basically what would have taken to end the institution of slavery without secession, without a civil war, right? So a lot of the times we hear these arguments that the Civil War was inevitable because of the stark differences between North and South. So the institution of slavery was always bound to be, you know, only abolished through a very violent means, which ended up happening in the 1860s, right? But I want to propose this alternate thought experiment that basically, suggests what would have taken for slavery to have abolished without any of those problems in a most peaceful and pragmatic way. All right, so let's get started. Uh, Basically, in a summary of what happened right after the codification of the slave codes, from 1660 to the times of the American Revolution, uh, the way that slavery developed wasn't the way most people imagine it, which is basically cotton farming, right? So it was basically more about tobacco, rice, indigo. So from that time, from 1660 all the way to the time of the American Revolution, it is the time in which gradually slavery became the backbone of the southern states. Now, the main mistake people make is assuming that slavery only existed in the southern states. All right, so slavery was highlighted the most in the southern states because, farmers relied on slave labor, but slavery also existed in the middle colonies, particularly in New York and New Jersey, and somewhat in a much lower capacity in the New England colonies, right? But slavery existed all throughout the 13 colonies, and after the American Revolution, some northern states began passing laws abolishing slavery, more than anything a gradual abolition. And so to answer one of the best questions that students have asked me in class, which is why didn't the US abolish slavery from the beginning, right, during the Constitutional Convention, right? This is a great question. And the answer is basically two reasons. Okay. Number one is that abolishing slavery was not the priority during the Constitutional Convention. Okay. The number one priority was basically creating a functioning system of government. Okay. So this is not to say that founding fathers did not want to abolish slavery, but the reality is that the southern states were not willing to concede, the abolishment of slavery to be part of the union, right? So the founding fathers were left with a basically with a dilemma, right? Do you want to abolish slavery, or do you want to have a functioning system of government that unites the 13 different states? Okay, so the reality is that they decided that the number one priority was creating a system of government that can unite all the states. Okay, so that is not to say they were not interested in abolishing slavery, particularly the northern states. But unfortunately and very tragically, at the time, the southern states were not willing to make those concessions. And that is where you see the Thrift Compromise, right? So that is the number one reason. Again, they not a priority and decided to sidestep the issue of slavery. And number two is that the reality is that most of the founding fathers believe this is a necessary evil, but it's going to fade away on its own, right? They see it, and don't get me wrong, they know exactly what they're doing, right? They know that slavery is a moral evil. They don't want a nation with slavery, most of these founding fathers. But at the same time, they are forced into this corner in which they need to make this decision. And the reality is that they see it as it's going to fade away on its own without a massive government intervention, right? And so, because they believe it's going to fade away on its own, they decide to concentrate on the first priority, right? So, these are the two main reasons why slavery was not abolished during the Constitutional Convention. The reality is that slavery was becoming less and less popular and less profitable. However, as you know, this is not what it happened, right? We know that slavery continued all the way until 1865, and it's not going to be abolished until the 13th Amendment. And what happened was the cotton gin, all right? The cotton gin is what actually, threw a wrench in all this, right? The cotton gin is what's going to make cotton extremely, extremely profitable and makes slavery almost impossible to abolish, right? Without a massive government intervention or a civil war, right? Secession, things like that, okay? And so the cotton gin transformed the way they were farming cotton, right? Before the cotton gin, most of the states concentrated a lot on tobacco, rice, and indigo. However, now cotton was extremely lucrative, right? Because you could produce 50 times as much cotton as you did before. All right. So now slavery is going to become extremely important to produce cotton, and it's going to become extremely lucrative, right? And when money is involved, it just it just makes it that much difficult to abolish slavery, because a lot of farmers began to gradually switch from farming all these other cash crops, to now farming cotton. And now slavery is going to become almost impossible to abolish in a peaceful or, pragmatic way, all right? Now it's going to require a massive government intervention, or, for states to secede, or civil war, which is exactly what is going to happen, right? But, up until this point, you could argue that maybe there was ways in which the government could have intervened, uh, to abolish slavery in a way more or less the way Britain did it, which was a gradual abolition, but it took a lot of money from the government to basically compensate slave owners to gradually emancipate all the slaves, and within a couple generations, in a peaceful manner, have an abolition, right? But after 1830, slavery is so profitable that it becomes almost impossible. Okay, and so think about it. I want to show you three different statistics that illustrate how massive the institution of slavery became by the 1860s, right? So, put it into perspective. From 1790 to 1860, in that year between the Cotton Gin and, right at the eve of the Civil War, we go from 700,000 slave population to 4 million, right? So it just exploded within those years, right? Also think about it. By that time, also cotton was the number one export in the US, right? So I believe cotton made something like 60% of all the exports in the US, right? So, it was just an enormous institution. And also, those 4 million slaves here in the US made up about $3 billion in, in value, right? So it was just incredibly difficult to dismantle this institution of slavery by that time, because also think about it, everyone with the exception of slaves, of of course, benefited from the institution of slavery. So of course the number one beneficiaries of slaves were the actual slave owners, right? The ones who are producing cotton, right? But also think about it, not only them, but people who bought cotton are benefiting from it, right? Because they're buying very cheap cotton. Okay, so all throughout the world, anyone who was buying slave produced cotton was benefiting from it, because otherwise you would have to buy cotton being produced by people who are getting paid, right? So cotton's gonna be more expensive, right? So think about it. In the northern states here in the US, those factories also benefited because, of course, they are buying cheaper cotton. But it doesn't stop at that, all right? Any regular citizen in the US who is buying textiles from northern factories that are being made with slave produced cotton are also benefiting from it, because, everything is cheaper, right? So, directly or indirectly, mostly, again, with the exception of slaves, mostly everyone benefited from the institution of slavery. And this is why by this time it became incredibly, incredibly difficult to dismantle the institution of slavery. Okay, so I want to cover a little bit of, I guess, facts to clear out some of the doubts that some of my students have about slavery, right? So the main one is, how many people own slaves by the time of the Civil War? This is going to vary. Okay, it's gonna go in a state by state basis, right? Because you're gonna have states like South Carolina that's gonna have almost 60% slave population, but then there's gonna also be other states that have as low as 10% population. Okay, so it's gonna vary, but in general, uh, The reality is that if you combine all of this, it's about 25% of the population own slaves. Okay, this is shocking to some students because I guess they imagine that most of the people own slaves in the South. They imagine that everyone has one or two slaves at least. But the reality is that the vast majority in the South does not own slaves, right? So 75% of the population in the South do not own slaves, and they basically do all the farm work between them and their families. Okay. And then when you break down the people that do have slaves, the vast majority of them own, either one through five slaves, right? And then even less than that was people who own 10 to 50. And then even less than that is the people who are, the elite plantation owners who have, over 100 slaves. Okay, so sometimes I guess because people watch movies like 12 Years a Slave or Django Unchained, they imagine that most in the South you're gonna see sprawling plantations with, huge amounts of slaves. But the reality is that it's 25% of the population that do own slaves. And out of those 25% of the population, the vast majority of them have only one through five, right? It is the planter class, the really, really, really wealthy one, which is the 1% of the population of those slave owners who have those huge plantations like you see in the movies, right? So this is more or less to paint a picture of how slavery looked like by the time of secession in 1860. The most And so I think the most important question coming out of all of this is, how do you abolish slavery without secession or without a civil war, right? What would have been the most pragmatic solution to abolishing slavery, right? So I guess you can look at the mirror of the British, who undertook a lot of money and a big government intervention to, to do this gradual abolition. And the reality is that, at least in my opinion, and you're welcome to disagree with me, is that the morally correct thing to do is, of course, immediate abolition. However, that is the most unpractical situation, and we saw it with the 13th Amendment, right? Even though we did have an immediate abolition, it resulted, in this Reconstruction era, which was extremely, extremely contentious, and it created a whole bunch of new problems that sometimes we're even dealing with them today. Okay, I believe the most pragmatic, and there's no easy solution, but yes, the most pragmatic situation would have been a gradual abolition, which is not the most morally correct thing to do. But we already did something similar in some of the northern states through the Northwest Ordinance, in which we had a gradual abolition. And, it would have also taken, a massive government spending, because basically we would have had to compensate the slave owners. And then we would have also need a constitutional amendment, and we would have also needed, perhaps, depending on who you ask, even some reparations for the slaves. So any way you want to look at it, it would have been very difficult after 1830. Okay, the better way to have abolished slavery was pre 1830, and the easiest would have been 1787, but it just didn't happen, right? And just to give you an idea on how difficult it would have been also to abolish slavery during those times, is to think about it like this. Just think about it in present times, right? Uh, do you think people would still have slaves if it wasn't because of a 13th Amendment? And what I mean to say is, if, we didn't have a 13th Amendment, do you think you would see people still owning slaves, right? Maybe not in the harshest conditions like they did in the 1800s, but do you think people would still own other people in present times, right? Just think about it a little bit, and then begin to realize, in present times, with the moral standards of the time, with the information that we have today, just, imagine how difficult it must have been to abolish slavery in a peaceful, pragmatic way that doesn't require secession, that doesn't require a civil war, Just imagine how much difficult it would have been during the 1800s, right? So put it into context and think about what it would have taken to abolish slavery in a peaceful way uh, without including a civil war, right? So I'll leave you with that thought, guys. Let me know what you think. I'll be around and be safe, okay? See y'all.